Let's turn our attention to the EU's AI Act. This is the world's first major law intended to govern artificial intelligence. And what makes it so significant isn't just what it regulates, but how it grapples with the incredibly powerful AI models that are already changing our world. So here is our roadmap for this discussion. First, we'll explore what I call a tale of two laws. Then we'll look at the specific definitions that assign liability. After that, we'll examine the systemic risk gateway, how the law decides what's truly powerful. We'll cover the resulting duties for providers, a significant risk I call the value chain trap. And finally, we'll discuss the governance of the act and why it's already under siege. All right, let's begin with our first point, a tale of two laws. To truly grasp the AI Act, you have to see it not as one single law, but as two very different regulatory approaches that have been fused together. And the reason for this is quite simple. The world of AI completely transformed while the legislation was being drafted. And this shows you that split perfectly. On one hand, you have Title III. This was the original idea, a classic product safety law. It was designed to regulate specific high-risk applications, things like AI in a medical device or software that screens job candidates. But then, generative AI exploded onto the scene, and lawmakers realized they had to regulate the source of the power, the underlying models themselves. That's where Title V comes in. It's a completely different approach, a move from reacting to specific uses to proactively governing the technology at its core. Now, let's talk about the language here, because it's incredibly important. You'll notice the term is general-purpose AI model, not foundation model, which you might hear more often in the industry. This was a very deliberate choice. Foundation model is tied to a specific way of building AI. By choosing a term that focuses on what an AI can do, its general-purpose capabilities, the lawmakers were trying to future-proof the regulation. They're aiming to govern the function, not the form, which is a very smart move when technology is evolving this quickly. So that brings us to our second point, definitions that assign liability. You see, in a piece of legislation like this, words are everything. These definitions aren't just there to help us understand terms. They're the very tools the law uses to assign responsibility and ultimately liability. Let's start with a general-purpose AI model, or GPAI. A good way to think about this is as the raw engine. It's the core technology itself, the complex model trained on huge data sets that gives it that incredible versatility. This is the fundamental engine that Title V is designed to regulate. Then we have the general-purpose AI system. And if the model is the engine, then the system is the vehicle. It's what makes that powerful engine usable. This could be a chatbot you interact with or an API that a developer builds into their own product. It's the crucial interface between the core technology and the end user. And the third key definition is systemic risk. Now, if you read the legal text, the definition might seem a little vague, almost circular, and that's by design. Think of it as a legal bucket. The definition creates the category, this concept of a high-impact risk. What actually fills that bucket, the specific criteria that designate a model as posing a systemic risk, we'll find in another part of the Act. So, putting it all together, you can see how these definitions create a clear chain of logic. The law makes a very careful distinction between the model, the engine, and the system, the vehicle. This is done specifically to separate the responsibilities of the model's creator from the responsibilities of the person who puts it on the market. And for the most powerful of these engines, it creates that special category of systemic risk. Which, of course, leads us to the next logical question, and our third section, the systemic risk gateway. How exactly does the Act sort the truly powerful models from the everyday ones? Well, it does so through a very specific mechanism. So how powerful is too powerful? The Act proposes a two-pronged answer to this question. And the first part begins with a clear quantitative threshold, a very, very big number. And that number is 10 to the power of 25 floating point operations, or flops. Now, you don't need to be a computer scientist to understand this. Just think of it as a measure of the sheer amount of computational energy used to train the model. If a model crosses this threshold, the law presumes it poses a systemic risk. But I want you to focus on that word, presumption. It's a powerful starting point, but it is not the final word. And that flexibility is absolutely crucial because technology is already making this number look a bit brittle. We're now seeing models with frontier capabilities being developed using far, far less computing power. This is sometimes called the DeepSeek problem.
It means that the flop's threshold on its own is becoming a less reliable proxy for actual risk.
Fortunately, the legislators saw this coming, and that's why they built in a qualitative safety net. The EU's new AI office has the power to designate a model as systemic even if it falls below that computational threshold. They can look at things like the number of parameters or performance on benchmarks. But the real game changer here is market reach. If a model acquires more than 10,000 registered business users within the EU, it can be flagged. This, right here, is arguably the Act's most important future-proofing tool.
All right, so a model has been identified and perhaps even designated as systemic. What happens next? This brings us to our fourth section, a duplex of duties. The law creates a two-tiered system of responsibilities for the providers of these models. The first tier of duties applies to all providers of general-purpose AI models. Think of these as baseline transparency requirements. You have to maintain technical documentation, provide information to developers who might use your model downstream, and you must have a policy to respect EU copyright law. And perhaps most significantly, you have to publish a detailed summary of the data used to train your model. That last point, as you can imagine, has many people preparing for a wave of copyright lawsuits. Now, for the models that are designated as systemic, the compliance burden gets much, much heavier. They have to do everything in Tier 1, plus a whole new set of demanding obligations. This includes conducting adversarial testing, what's often called red teaming, assessing and mitigating all possible systemic risks on an ongoing basis, reporting any serious incidents to the authorities, and ensuring a very high level of cybersecurity. We're talking about a truly significant operational and financial commitment. And this leads to a really interesting and potentially problematic situation for the open source community. You see, the Act has certain exemptions for open source projects, but those exemptions are not absolute. An open source model could become very successful, very popular, and cross that threshold of 10,000 business users. If the AI office then designates it as systemic, poof, the exemptions vanish. Suddenly, a community-driven project could be facing the exact same massive compliance burden as a multi-billion-dollar corporation. It's a kind of popularity penalty. So far, we've focused on the duties of model developers, but that's only part of the picture. This brings us to Section 5, the value chain trap. This is arguably one of the most critical and least understood parts of the Act for businesses. It's a situation where simply using an AI tool can unexpectedly turn you into a regulated entity. Let's walk through exactly how this repurposing trap works. Imagine an employer. They start using a general-purpose chatbot for basic internal questions. At this point, under the Act, they are simply a deployer, a user. But then, they decide to adapt that same chatbot to help them screen resumes and rank job applicants. Well, employment is classified as a high-risk use case. By making that change, the company has just repurposed the system. And in the eyes of the law, they have instantly been reclassified from a simple deployer to a provider of a high-risk AI system. And with that comes the full, crushing weight of all the compliance duties we've been discussing. This leads us to our final section, governance and a law under siege. It's crucial to remember that just because the AI Act is written down, its story isn't over. In fact, the battle for its future has really just begun. Its real-world implementation is now the subject of an intense struggle between regulators and some very powerful interests. And one of the first major skirmishes in this battle came from Meta. They publicly refused to sign the EU's voluntary code of practice, which was intended to be a stepping stone to compliance. Their public reasoning was that it went far beyond the scope of the AI Act and created legal uncertainty. But make no mistake, this was more than just a legal dispute. It was a clear political signal challenging the EU's approach to implementing the law. And this pressure isn't just coming from one direction. The Act is facing what you could call a pincer movement. From the outside, you have pressure from the US government, which is concerned about regulations that might disproportionately affect American tech companies. But then you have intense pressure from the inside, from some of Europe's own biggest industrial players, companies like Airbus and Mercedes, who have called for a significant pause before the law is fully enforced. So let's summarize the key points we've covered. First, the AI Act is best understood as a novel two-part regulation, one part for applications and one for the underlying models. Second, its definitions are meticulously crafted to allocate legal liability along the value chain.
Third, it identifies systemic risk using a dual gateway of both raw computing power and, crucially, market reach. Fourth, businesses need to be acutely aware of the repurposing trap, which can turn a user into a regulated provider overnight. And finally, the Act's implementation is not guaranteed. It faces formidable political and corporate opposition.
So we are left with this concluding thought. The AI Act has been written, but its story is very much unfinished. It represents an ambitious attempt to create a global standard for governing this technology. The fundamental question now is not just about the text of the law, but whether it can withstand the immense pressures it faces to become that standard, or if it will become a casualty of the very tech wars it seeks to manage.